Good too.
Looking at some of the images from Murakami Ford, I went to see the show in LA too. I was just thinking about the book called The Accident of Art. It's a conversation between Paul Virilio and Sibel Lotringer. And in it, I mean, this is a reduction of their long, very extensive conversation, but he says that art of the 20th century is the art of war, and that the art of disfiguring is a process that you have to take into account the world wars and the Pacific War, the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, for example, are implicit in those kinds of, in his argument, I think, Paul Virilio's argument.
Mm.
And as I was looking at, you know, the disfiguring, I mean, I really appreciated your analysis of all of the the bodies that are disfigured, and the abstraction that has occurred in Japanese society, especially within youth culture, because I mean, if you go to Japan and kids are sitting next to each other and they don't even talk to each other anymore, so that they're constantly texting each other in order to communicate, but they actually don't look at each other and they don't talk to each other, which I think is something that, I mean, so that's out there. So that's just a comment. And the question that I had, though, was concerning this type of production, because Murakami is obviously one of the most successful Japanese artists and rakes in, I mean, somebody was talking about his Louis Vuitton bags being sold for tens of thousands of dollars. And in thinking about creative societies, in a societal engagement, how does somebody like Murakami's art practice, how do we think about that within the discussions that we've been having in the seminar, right? In terms of cultural industries as a part of the larger effort in the humanities, as a part of policymaking, because I mean, I don't know how engaged he is with the Japanese society in his work, but I mean, it's a practice that has its own set of, I think, its own set of internal dynamic. And so I was just thinking about how you think about this type of art practice vis-a-vis the kinds of art practices that we've been talking about. And in particular, I think Lisa Parks's videos yesterday, I mean, I think it's, you know, somebody like the woman who made the documentary about the Caspian, the pipeline, is somebody who's very much engaged with social issues. So there's that kind of dichotomy there of art practices like Murakami's and art practices in the line of the work that Lisa Parks is going to talk about today.
Yeah, I'm not really trying to use, I mean, this isn't exemplary practice or something, I guess. That's why I've split in this kind of schizoid way between art as social action and art as total business. You know, I mean, the container stuff to this other stuff. So I think this is also really interesting. I don't want to generalize or, as I say, to claim critical, you know, pointedly critical significance for this. I just tried to read this work, having been invited to write for this Murakami catalogue, and that was in itself an interesting invitation. You know, if I don't turn down a commission like that, because I know that while nobody ever reads art catalogues, it does circulate. You know, so and I like the idea of a stealth model of circulation, so that people don't get what they expect. But you know, so I did try to read it symptomatically and use Murakami rather, you know, as something to think with. And yeah, partly about Japanese culture, though I don't want to invest in some, you know, specific Japanese critique. When I'm talking about Japan, I'm talking about sort of hyperbolic or hyper-realization of tendencies which are absolutely imminent within our culture. You know, like the prolongation of adolescence, so that in a recent poll, I think most US citizens polled said that they believed somebody wasn't fully adult until the age of 28. And this has got something to do with the crisis in transition from, you know, school to work. There's something to do with that people are living longer and so forth. But when you compare that with the industrial period, when a lot of people working full time and considered adults at the age of 14, you know, which is my parents' generation, we're in a very different world. So I was interested in using Murakami as a kind of way of lighting up some of the, joining up the dots between all these cultural tendencies, and in some ways using that to, talk about the creative industries, or the world in which the creative industries are seen as, significant and central to the definition of the new moment. So partly I'm trying to look at the psychosexual subjective implications of war, and post-war culture, but also the sublimation and denial of war, and the euphemization of war. That's why Sado-Q is so interesting, and the emergence of what I think are, globalizable, passive-aggressive structures of freedom. Passive aggression and the infantilization, the matrix of humiliation have got something to do with, the aftermath of the American century. It's what we've given the world, and that's what service economy demands to a certain degree. The concealment of affect, and certainly the sublimation of conflicts of interest, so that you have to be nicey nice on the outside. I mean, from the Starbucks barista, greeting you and taking your name. So I mean, I don't know how far we've really tracked the implications of this shift from an industrial to a service economy, and what it might mean culturally, spiritually, psychologically, politically. So partly that's what I wanted to look at. And then, of course, passive aggression has a particular pejorative kind of feel for us. We think, it's not real passivity, it's not real aggression, it's wishy-washy or something. But then, I thought, well, if you look at the martial arts, like jiu-jitsu or judo, the gentle way, so on, using your opponent's weaknesses to defeat, your opponent, then passive aggression, is a form of warfare that has been perfected. Actually, it's the opposite of that kind of stomping everybody from on high with bombing and so forth. So, I mean, all these issues are things that I want to consider, and and as far as Murakami's position in relation to Japanese culture is concerned, his exhibition is sponsored by the Japan Society. He is seen as a kind of ambassador, I think, for a kind of almost neo-nationalist Japanese culture, which involves producing genealogies and histories of Japanese culture connected to the feudal era and to the imperial era, which have been regarded as problematic, since 1945. So he's an interesting figure. I think he almost, I met him, and he gave us a talk at MoCA. He almost presents himself as a kind of shogun of Japanese art and culture, self-consciously, and so I think that's it's an interesting case study. How it fits in with the kind of work that Lisa's talking about, and the critical work, and the work I was referring to with containers. It's like different. It's a different case. It's like comparing apples and oranges, but it's still operating within a transformed, globalized art exchange environment, art, fashion, culture environment, where art itself is being positioned differently. It's no longer, necessarily marginal. It's no longer, can be regarded as autonomous. It's taking its place, in a kind of post-industrial entertainment environment, where, DJs and fashionistas and art all operate together. So there's a new configuration, and I think, Murakami is a genius navigating that.
I guess it's a commentary on the two sculptures, the Lonesome Cowboy. I mean, in some ways, those two sculptures can be seen as a set because it references a Japanese mythology, religious holiday, in fact, the cowboy and the milkmaid, where they're separated 364 days of the year and meet one day out of the year. And it's a national religious festival about desire and wishes. And so given that it doesn't look like it taps into Japanese mythology, do you think, Andrew Ross mentioned yesterday that China has a monopoly on mining its cultural heritage as a cultural product. Do you think Japan has a similar monopoly when in these new forms of superflat and art where Japanese mythology, heritage, culture isn't as readily distinguishable? Does it have the same type of monopoly over its cultural product?
It's sort of monopoly, a gatekeeper monopoly over its own national heritage and
That it would be almost impossible
archive.
for I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've just transformed my whole read of that piece. And if I was a real anthropologist and knew been to Japan and spoke to it in Japanese, I probably would have known that. In fact, I didn't know it. It's part of the game, actually, I think, of whispers and of miscommunication that in part Murakami is doing with American culture too, with Anglo-American culture. There's a deliberate misconstrual, a desire to perversely get the wrong point, or so. And that's interesting in itself. I think that there is this. There's no transparency. And it's more like a video game, or it's some kind of form of combat of interpretation. My text was subjected to readings by Murakami's people, but they weren't literary critics; they were lawyers. So they come back and say this is wrong. At one point you say, Murakami outsources to China, because I was talking about the panda piece, and it was metaphorical. I said, that's wrong, he doesn't outsource to China, this is bad, so I've got to change that. So it's like dealing with Disney. The whole point is to protect the brand, and if I blunder and make a mistake, it doesn't matter, who cares? Murakami isn't going to tell me where I get it wrong, or he's not going to help me do my read, but he is going to protect the brand. So it's a peculiar form of interpretive exchange and negotiation, where the artist is above and beyond. He places himself above and beyond whatever idiot critics like myself try to make of his work, and that's interesting. It's very unlike the way most artists, Western artists, demand that you understand their intentions. It's almost as if he doesn't want us to get what he's getting at, necessarily. He just wants it to sell, and he wants to enhance the brand, strengthen it, globalize it, and dominate with it. But thanks, that was really, sorry Toby, but that was really useful for me, at least. Okay.